Hmm. Not bad, but it has been a while since that got made, hasn't it? I, I'd say, I'd say it could go for a remake, and I think I know just the guy. Hello? Yeah, can you get Michael Bay on the line immediately? That's right, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about reboots and remakes in the horror genre. In particular, a major wave of them that came throughout the 2000s and early 2010s. One of my favorite things about the horror genre is the originality often on display. And while I can see the value in sometimes going back and improving or updating a classic if need be, there is definitely a noticeable disdain towards a lot of the movies from this time period. So is this criticism warranted, or are there actually some hidden gems that might even surpass the original versions? Let's find out.
One question worth asking before we really get into things is why? Why were there all these reboots and remakes of classic horror films and franchises specifically at the start of the 21st century? Well, there are many reasons, from greediness to an obsession with making money, but the true root cause seems to be that, like with the inception of movies with sound and movies filmed in color, modern technology made some see older films as outdated and in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint. The year 2000 was seen for a long time as this unbelievably futuristic horizon that was destined to bring many new advancements with it, and there were indeed some quite revolutionary upgrades, such as advancements in computer-generated imagery, better known as CGI, as well as, of course, much better camera quality. There have, as I said, been other eras full of remakes, and a combination of nostalgia being easily exploitable to make lots of money, this new tech, and a lack of original ideas within major film studios after they had seen how successful more formulaic crowd pleasers could be, made the 2000s the perfect time to repeat this phenomenon. And while many will point to 2002's The Ring as being the inciting incident for this renaissance of regurgitation, that was mainly made to translate the film, both linguistically and culturally, into a successful product for Western audiences.
So much like the obsolete snooze fest in front of me, this mystifying epoch can be pretty much traced back to a godly recreation. That's right, I'm talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. For the third time this month.
In 2003, a remake of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out, being primarily made by a Michael Bay-owned production company, and with a lot of praise being thrown toward it. It may come as a surprise, but this movie is actually well regarded by many horror fans, including myself. It's a unique take on the story that feels faithful and reverent toward what came before it, but not to a fault. The film manages to inject unique ideas into the classic story and carry over much of what made the 1974 movie so compelling, which led to an epiphany, a grand revelation, one that rippled throughout the horror film industry. That studios could remake old stuff instead of making new stuff and make just as, if not more, money. Why bother risking it all on a new IP when you have one everyone already knows sitting right there? Well, that mentality is what led to the cavalcade of horror remakes over the next decade, which many now revile in retrospect. It wasn't an immediate reaction, but it's clear to see the impact that the Texas Chainsaw remake had. Not only did it become by far the highest grossing and most profitable entry in the franchise, but it successfully revived a horror series so messy and broken that many weren't even aware it was a series.
And the success of this movie leads us into essentially the first major wave between 2004 and 2006, which I would call the experimental era, where studios were making these movies mainly for money, but also due to legitimate attempts to go back to previous ideas and IPs and maybe make something out of it. It didn't always work, but there was definitely a lot of passion behind most horror remakes of this time period. Okay, I said most, not all.
One of the major ones that people talk about is The Grudge, which, similar to The Ring, is a remake of a J-horror movie that translates it into English. This, in my opinion, is its own sort of phenomenon that doesn't exactly pertain to the remake fever that we're discussing today, meaning the first landmark remake after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. Quite possibly the best movie Snyder has ever made, this remake is far from my favorite horror film ever, but it does have some absolutely fantastic moments, such as the truly spectacular opening, and you can tell that there's a real attempt to modernize a classic here and to use updated technology to tell a familiar but revamped story. And when you get down to it, that's what the best horror remakes are all about. Just look at The Thing. Nowadays, the 1950s original is seldom ever remembered, but its remake is a cult classic as it took the ideas of suspense and isolation that worked in its predecessor and utilized all of the more modern tools at its disposal to make them more potent than ever before. And even though some of the horror remakes at this time were crap, the fact that some were as good as these two, mind you, two of the most high budget of all these remakes, really shows the more earnest intentions at play. And in 2005, we saw this trend spread far and wide across the world of film, cementing itself in the horror world with remakes of The Fog, House of Wax, Dr. Caligari, and the Amityville Horror, as well as beginning to influence other genres with the massive remakes of King Kong and War of the Worlds.
The experimentation is on full display in this year specifically, as we have so many series of varying degrees of relevance being tapped into, resulting in films with varying degrees of quality.
2006, yet another big year. We got classic remakes of The Omen, When a Stranger Calls, Black Christmas, The Hills Have Eyes, The Wickerman. Oh no. Oh god, no. Yeah, much like with Enron, 2006 is when things really went off the rails for horror remakes. They started to become more concentrated in terms of their crappiness, and rather than feeling like earnest but failed attempts to revitalize IPs that certain creators really cared about, the corporateness of it all became glaringly obvious. Movies that didn't really need remakes, movies that trampled all over the originals in blatant ways, it was a real issue, to the point that bad horror remakes already became a cliche by this time, mainly with the intense memification of the Wickerman remake.
But that's one of the beautiful things about horror. It reacts, it morphs, it changes. It's the most raw and unfiltered genre of movie that there is. So when people get tired of nonsensical trends, someone comes along to change it, to reform the face of horror. And that's exactly what happened here within basically a year.
2007 and 2008 saw the release of various high-profile and often high-quality horror movies that became iconic and beloved on their own merits, rather than relying on name recognition. The Mist, Paranormal Activity, The Strangers, Trick or Treat, and others began to show the potential of this genre once more. Immediately once horror remakes became a tired tradition instead of a refreshing experiment, more original titles started releasing to lots of success. Horror remakes became less common and eventually started to fade away massively. You had your occasional prom night or funny games, but these started becoming an uncommon novelty once more. Studios earned back the right to remake horror films from time to time because they were providing a decent dose of original content at the same time.
So the studios were eating their greens by giving us The Strangers every once in a while, but also got to have their treat when they remade Halloween, and everything in the horror genre was peaceful and perfect. Or at least that's what you would think.
In actuality, this was just a slight reprieve from what would become the most brutal years of the remake rampage, the era of the reboots in the late 2000s and early 2010s. While the Halloween reboot in 2007 was successful at the box office, it wasn't received well by fans the same way as earlier horror remakes, meaning the biggest name in the whole genre wasn't able to revive this trend successfully. So, who could?
Why, only his biggest fan of all time. Of course.
That's right, Jason Voorhees, brought back once more after being burned in toxic waste, blown up, sent to hell, shot out into the vacuum of space, and having fought his nemesis Freddy, now had to apply his seeming invincibility to the remake subgenre. And wouldn't you know, the bastard did it. In 2009, the Friday reboot was a runaway success, making a boatload of money and earning dismal scores, which, let's be honest, really doesn't matter at all for a movie in this franchise. And just as Leatherface ushered in this era, Jason revitalized it and gave it a fresh coat of paint. Poetic, isn't it? Just as how Texas Chainsaw was the very start of the slasher genre, and Friday shot it into the mainstream pop culture, they played the same roles here. My Bloody Valentine, Last House on the Left, Sorority Row, The Wolfman, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Crazies, I Spit on Your Grave, Fright Night, Carrie, Piranha 3D, Evil Dead, Maniac. It was like a tsunami of remakes, a huge movement, and yet people didn't like them. Everyone thought once more they had a chance to revive every franchise under the sun and make a shit ton of cash like Friday did, but most failed completely. Now, many did end up making some money, but they didn't impress in terms of quality, and after a few years, people again became sick of these movies.
So what's really the solution to all of this? It seems like one deadly, miserable cycle that never ends. Well, allow me to explain. You see, the problem isn't that they're remaking horror movies at all. In fact, there are many that tons of fans enjoy, even ones from this era. But that's because those movies felt special. Rather than getting spoon-fed repeats of the same series year after year, we feel like specific franchises are getting love, getting care, getting attention from people with passion and actually good ideas on where to take it next. And that feels great.
When a rough-around-the-edges cult classic masterpiece from 30 years ago gets a fantastic remake that captures the spirit of the original, that's inspiring. When an unknown chiller gets a blockbuster update from a visionary director turning it into one of the most incredible visual spectacles in cinematic history, that's inspiring. Horror can be an amazing thing if it's just handled with respect. The best remakes stand out from the crowd and feel necessary. We've had many waves of these over the years, including more recently with tons of so-called requels that retcon previous sequels and start from an earlier point in the franchise, but when so many come out at once, it's less likely that any singular one will stand out.
So let's continue to make amazing original horror films that pave the way for a better future. And if the time is right and the ideas are there, a remake ain't half bad either. But when it's hijacked by a greedy attempt to exploit a beloved name, then that goes against everything I love about this genre. And with all that being considered, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you all my remake of that classic painting. Yeah, that's right. I pulled a 1990s Psycho remake on your asses and didn't change a damn thing. I got you all good. It's pretty fucking hard to recreate that, though, I gotta be honest. And for what? The original looks the exact same. Maybe that was actually a huge waste of my time. Huh. Anyway, this has been Terror Time. Thanks so much for watching, and keep on terrifying till time tends to terminate. Goodbye.